loss in Russia.
The most defining moments in geopolitical history are rarely the loudest. They aren't the parades or the speeches. They are the moments when a carefully constructed reality dissolves in an instant. We just watched one of those moments happen. For 3 years, Vladimir Putin has wagered his entire regime on a single foundational lie, that the war is something happening over there, that it is a distant police action, a necessary unpleasantness that will never touch the secure, affluent lives of the Moscow elite or the average citizen within the ring road. That lie didn't just die last night, it was incinerated. At approximately 3:15 a.m. Moscow time, the illusion of Russian untouchability ended. We aren't talking about a stray drone hitting a border town depot. We aren't talking about partisans lighting a recruitment center on fire in Siberia. We are talking about a complex, multi-domain, precision strike driven by high-level intelligence penetration that hit the nerve center of the Russian Federation, the Kremlin district, the geographical heart of Russian power. When you look at the footage circulating on Telegram channels before the FSB could scrub it, you aren't just seeing fire. You are seeing the physical manifestation of intelligence failure at a catastrophic, regime-threatening level. Let's be forensic about what actually took place, because the details matter infinitely more than the initial headlines. This was not a spray-and-pray attack. This was surgery. Ukrainian special operations and intelligence services didn't just launch munitions, they identified specific buildings within the Moscow center that were operating under civilian cover, but were actually acting as crucial nodes for military coordination and logistics. Think about what that requires. It's not enough to know a building exists. You have to know who is inside, what schedules they keep, which floor houses the server room, and when the critical personnel are present. That level of fidelity means Ukraine has human sources or signals intelligence penetrations deep inside the Moscow security apparatus. They didn't just beat the air defenses, they beat the counterintelligence state. Western intelligence agencies watched this unfold in real time, initially assessing it might be a symbolic gesture, a Doolittle raid designed for headlines. Within hours, those assessments were violently revised downward. These were substantive hits on infrastructure that connects political leadership to battlefield commanders. And the Russian response, that is where the true story lies. The silence was deafening. For 4 hours, the state media apparatus, usually so agile at spinning disasters into tales of thwarted terrorism, was paralyzed. When the gears finally started turning, they didn't produce the usual fiery defiance. Vladimir Putin appeared on camera, visibly subdued, and used a word he has surgically excised from his vocabulary for over 1,000 days of warfare: losses. When a dictator who has built his entire persona on the projection of absolute, consequence-free power is forced to look into a camera and admit that the enemy has hurt him in his own home, the psychological architecture of his rule begins to buckle. This acknowledgement wasn't a moment of transparency. It was a moment of forced capitulation to reality. To understand why this is so devastating, we have to zoom out and look at the unspoken social contract that defines modern authoritarian Russia. Putin's deal with the population, particularly the influential middle class in Moscow and St. Petersburg, has always been explicit in its transactional nature. You grant me absolute political authority. You stay out of the streets, you don't ask questions about where the oil money goes, and in return, I guarantee stability. I guarantee that the chaos of the 90s will never return. And crucially, that the violent foreign adventures we undertake will remain distant abstractions. Russian citizens in the capital have lived relatively normal lives while their military leveled Mariupol and Bakhmut. That asymmetry is not an accident. It is a domestic political survival strategy. The war must remain a television show for Muscovites. Last night, Ukraine canceled that show and replaced it with the reality of air raid sirens and burning government buildings less than 2 kilometers from Red Square. When the war arrives on the doorstep of the very people whose apathy keeps the regime afloat, the calculation changes instantly. The abstract becomes concrete. The distant becomes immediate. The special military operation becomes a war for survival, and suddenly the leader who promised security looks like the architect of disaster. We need to spend time on the mechanics of this failure because it speaks to the systemic corrosion within the Russian military-industrial complex. Moscow is supposed to be covered by the most dense, sophisticated air defense umbrella on Earth. Layers of S-400s, Panzer systems, advanced electronic warfare jamming domes. It is sold to the world and to the Russian people as impenetrable. Ukrainian long-range drones didn't just get lucky. They exploited specific charted gaps in that radar coverage. They utilized approach vectors that Russian commanders, in their arrogance or incompetence, had left unmonitored. This suggests Ukraine knew the placement, the rotation schedules, and the technical limitations of Moscow's defensive grid better than the generals in charge of it. Furthermore, the cyber component of this attack cannot be overstated. Reports indicate that Moscow's emergency communication networks were disrupted for nearly 30 minutes during the initial strikes. This crippled a coordinated first responder reaction. This is the definition of modern hybrid warfare, blinding the enemy electronically while striking them kinetically. It demonstrates a level of operational sophistication that few nations on Earth possess, and one that Russia clearly convinced itself Ukraine could never achieve. Russia has consistently made one fatal error throughout this entire conflict, underestimating adversary capability while overestimating their own technological superiority. They believed their encryption was unbreakable. It wasn't. They believed their hypersonics were unstoppable. They weren't. They believed Moscow was a sanctuary. It is not. Every time Russia establishes a red line based on an assumption of Ukrainian limitation, Ukraine crosses it with a capability Russia didn't know they had. This creates a paralyzing dilemma in the Kremlin. You cannot plan a war when your fundamental assumptions about the battlefield are constantly being proven catastrophically wrong. This brings us to the psychological state of Vladimir Putin right now. We are watching a leader under immense, conflicting internal pressure. He is running an economy that is overheating wildly as it tries to sustain a total war footing while under unprecedented sanctions. He has military commanders screaming for mass mobilization and resources they don't have to feed meat grinder assaults for incremental gains. He has a security apparatus, the FSB and GRU, demanding to know who the moles are that allowed Ukraine to map the Kremlin district. And he has a public that is waking up to the smell of smoke in their own capital. When an authoritarian leader is humiliated in this specific way, when his core competency, the protection of the state's center, is shown to be a hollow shell, they rarely respond with rational calculus. They respond from a place of wounded pride and desperation. The danger now is extreme because Putin needs to re-establish the aura of power that was just punctured. We are seeing signs of internal panic. Air defense around Moscow is at its highest alert level since the initial invasion. Security protocols have been locked down. They are hunting for leaks, but the damage is done. You cannot unring the bell of vulnerability. The international dimension of this strike is equally critical, and the reaction from NATO tells us everything about how the ground has shifted. The statement from the alliance was a masterclass in diplomatic signaling. It emphasized Ukraine's right to strike legitimate military targets under international law, while subtly noting the precision of the attack, military coordination centers, not apartment blocks. This is the West giving a green light, retroactively legitimizing the strategy of taking the war directly to Russian soil, provided it remains within the laws of armed conflict. It is a stark contrast to the early days of the war, when the mere thought of a Ukrainian shell landing inside Russia caused panic in Western capitals about escalation management. Why the shift? Because Western intelligence, like Ukrainian intelligence, has realized that Russia's escalation dominance is largely a bluff. Putin's nuclear threats have yielded diminishing returns. The West is now willing to tolerate a much higher level of risk because they see a Russian state that is far more brittle than advertised. They are allowing Ukraine to boil the frog, incrementally increasing the pressure on the Kremlin, testing the breaking point. President Zelensky's response was swift and framed with the icy clarity of a leader who knows he now holds the initiative. Distance does not provide immunity. That is the new doctrine. He is telling every Russian official involved in the occupation of Ukraine, from the generals in Rostov to the bureaucrats in Moscow, that they are now on the playing field. Crucially, this strike did not happen in a vacuum. It was part of a synchronized, theater-wide acceleration. At the same time, Moscow was burning. Ukrainian forces were hammering military logistics in occupied Crimea and disrupting command networks across the Eastern Front. This is what military planners call imposing multiple dilemmas. If Russia pulls air defense assets back from the front lines to protect Moscow, they leave their occupation forces vulnerable. If they keep assets at the front to sustain their offensive, they leave their capital exposed to further humiliation. Ukraine is forcing Russia to make impossible choices between political survival at home and military viability abroad. We have entered a new, much darker phase of this war. We are past the point of proxy conflict and into a direct test of national wills where the battlefield has expanded to include the political psychology of the opponent's population. Russia's only remaining card, short of nuclear suicidal ideation, is terror. We must anticipate a brutal, disproportionate response aimed at Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. Putin will try to wash away the humiliation of a precision military strike on Moscow with mass, indiscriminate violence against Kiev or Kharkiv. He needs to show his domestic audience that he can still inflict pain, even if he cannot prevent it. But terror is a weapon of diminishing returns when used against a population that has already endured everything. It will not break Ukrainian resolve. What it will do is further solidify Western support and accelerate the delivery of even longer-range capabilities. The myth of the invincible Kremlin is gone. The social contract of the apathetic Russian citizen is fraying. The competence of the Russian security state has been exposed as a fraud. Vladimir Putin is weaker today than at any point in his 23 years of power, because the one thing a dictator cannot survive is being made to look ridiculous and impotent in front of his own people and the world. Ukraine didn't just blow up a building last night. They blew up a 20-year psychological operation. They proved that the emperor has no air defense and that the walls of the Kremlin are paper thin. The war has come home, and no amount of propaganda can put the smoke back inside the building. This isn't the last chapter. It's the beginning of the most dangerous one. If you want to understand where this trajectory leads before the rest of the world catches up, you need to be watching the right signals. Subscribe. Let's keep our eyes open together.